IVM.
Hi everybody, just wanted to ask everyone for a quick favor. We're running a brand survey right now and would really appreciate it if you could let us know what you think about the advertising on IVM. Go to ivmpodcast.com/survey and do let us know. As part of this, we'll be selecting 10 random participants and sending them some IVM swag, so do fill out those surveys.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Aditya Ramanathan. Before we begin, I would like to mention that admissions are now open for our 12-week graduate certificate programs in public policy, defense and foreign affairs, technology and policy, and health and life sciences. The application deadline is the 28th of August and the cohort begins on the 1st of September. To know more, visit our website takshashila.org.in/courses. Now, coming on to today's episode, I'm joined by my fellow Aditya Parikh, and we want to talk about drones and other autonomous systems, especially aerial autonomous systems today. This comes, of course, in the backdrop of the attack on the MV Mercer Street oil tanker around the Gulf of Oman, allegedly by some sort of so-called suicide drone. Now, what on earth is a so-called suicide drone, and how are they different from, say, other types of weapon systems? This is important because drones have emerged as this very hyped up piece of technology on battlefields in recent years. Maybe it's this unprecedented attack on civil infrastructure. And this could include, for example, the latest attack on an oil tanker, but also, for example, the amazing unprecedented attack on oil infrastructure in Saudi Arabia's Aramco facilities in 2019. And this attack, mind you, happened despite the presence of a multi-layered air defense system. Then, of course, you have the Nagorno-Karabakh war between Armenia and Azerbaijan in 2020, where, again, the use of Turkish-made autonomous or weapons or drones caught a lot of headlines, got a lot of attention. The reality of drones is actually a lot more complicated. Drones is actually a catch-all phrase that could mean all sorts of things. People use the word drone to mean what are effectively commercial off-the-shelf toys. They're also used to describe very high-end systems like the Reaper or the Predator, which are basically warplanes that operate autonomously, right? So what are drones? How are they, for example, different from cruise missiles? This is an interesting thing for us to. This is an interesting subject for us to ponder over, because where does a suicide drone and a loitering munition begin, or are they really the same thing? And where does a loitering munition end and a cruise missile begin? They are probably the same class of weapon systems, but perhaps based across an entire spectrum. And the fact that you have these variances is probably to a great extent down to developments in information and communication technologies over the last 30 years that have enabled us to have all sorts of loitering munitions and often being able to build these weapon systems at fairly modest prices. Now, Aditya, firstly, welcome back to All Things Policy.
Thanks, Aditya. It's great to be back.
Absolutely. Now, I want to start with MV Mercer, and I'll chime in over here. But what is it that strikes you about this attack? The U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has blamed Iran for the attack, and this attack has been described as using a one-way explosive UAV.
Yeah, I think the wording has been garnering a lot of attention from folks who study asymmetric tactics and gray zone activities in strategic circles. So I think, as you rightly pointed out, that the difference between and the border between what's a loitering munition, what a cruise missile is, or any other kind of projectile which stays up for a bit. I mean, what does it matter if the platform is launching another projectile or the platform itself is the projectile and goes and bashes into the target? I mean, these borders are only effective when you intend to retain that platform. So, in this case, so for example, the stuff that we'll talk about later in the episode as well, I mean, the threshold for retention of that platform has been quite low for most asymmetric groups who've been using these platforms for plausibly deniable attacks, I would say. So the utility of retaining that platform is very little for them, and they just basically use these as very disposable platforms. So it's no surprise to me that the US has taken cognizance of it, and it really ties into their war on terror and the Iraq and Afghanistan experience that they've had, where UAVs have also been used in asymmetric tactics by insurgent groups that they've been fighting. So I think there's a dimension of, I don't know, the lexicon seeping through to the top of the US chain of command. I think, yeah, this is how it went. In one of those rare moments, the words, the lexicon has actually traveled up the chain of command and not down.
Yeah, that is fascinating. I mean, what really strikes me about this whole incident with Mercer Street, I mean, of course, it's a tragic incident. We've had at least two fatalities from it. And what strikes me is that this is, it's if Iran is responsible for this, it's not terribly unusual because Iran doesn't have an air force. If you're wondering why Iran uses a lot of missiles, why it uses drones or suicide UAVs or whatever you want to call them, is because they don't have a fleet of fixed wing warplanes. The result of the revolution, sanctions, and so on has meant that what warplanes they had, including ancient F-14 Tomcats from the Americans, are all basically not serviceable anymore. And what that means is that Iran has essentially built a vast missile force. This is ballistic missiles, it's cruise missiles, as well as what are essentially variants of cruise missiles or platforms that resemble cruise missiles, like UAVs. And like you said, Iran is able to use these in a variety of modes, including deniable missions, like possibly the one on Mercer Street, and almost certainly with the attack on the Saudi Aramco oil facilities in 2019 September, which may have involved also the Houthi rebels in Yemen. By the way, it's really unclear exactly what happened in that attack. It's figuring out what happened exactly in September 2019 will be, it's probably one of those things. It's going to take a few years. Now, connected to this, Aditya, the other thing that keeps getting talked about, and you have gone into this quite a bit, is that a lot of these systems are actually improvised, right? So you have the high end UAVs that we talked about that are basically indistinguishable from cruise missiles. But you also have these improvised ones that are essentially built on commercial off the shelf drones, things that are used for pleasure, things that are used as toys. Can you tell us about how these type of off the shelf drones are used by both perhaps state and non-state actors?
Certainly. So, I'd also like to point out that there's another category where you're not really sure if the non-state actor is actually state-sponsored or not. This could be, say, for example, Hamas and the Israel situation, where a lot of IEDs which do qualify as UAVs. If you look at that, it doesn't say that it has to have an electric propulsion system to be a UAV. So, a very crude balloon that is carrying an explosive IED is more or less a UAV in that context, and they've been bleeding the Israelis quite a bit. So, coming to the topic, so I'm quite interested in studying the asymmetric gray zone tactics that most of these insurgent groups use, and I think there's no shortage of loitering munitions, aerial IEDs, in improvised, cobbled together, and improvised off-the-shelf kind of modes. So I think 2015 to 2018, there was a huge ho-hum around the use of improvised drones by ISIS in Iraq. So they, according to some sources I've read, have inflicted significant casualties on Iraqi military vehicles and personnel in this time frame, 2015, 2018. And I think possibly up to 2020, but the attacks diminished quite a bit until then. So these improvised drones and the groups that were fielding them progressed from their garage workshops, where they were making basically aero models, which children often make for their recreational purposes. That kind of drone with styrofoam wings and fuselages made out of scrap metal to proper commercial quadcopters people often use for recreational use in the West, stuff like aerial photography, that sort of thing. So now quadcopters and the like, they've been used off the shelf, and they've been used, as far as I understand, for in the Indian subcontinent's context for cross-border narcotics smuggling. So on across the Indo-Pak border. So now there have been instances where quadcopters have also carried weapons to insurgents across the border. In Iraq and other battlefields of perpetual war in the West Asia region, this was just adapted in strike roles too, by fitting the drones with crude ordnance release apparatus, basically. So this amounted to some sort of a clutch that could grab a disassembled RPG charge, a 40 millimeter mortar or grenade charge, that sort of thing, which was carried by a quadcopter or improvised homemade drone, depending on the exact year and the resources of the group that was fielding them. So they basically released that charge right on top of a command bunker or a personnel's head. So they were using these as very precision strike kind of disposable weapons, as far as I understand. And they were pretty much brought down by basically adapting very simple measures. They weren't, at first, most of the defense that they were taking on, Iraqi forces and the US forces that were attached to them, they weren't really taking very high tech measures against them. Things as simple as nets around the command bunker are pretty much effective in stopping these quadcopters. So, when you talk about asymmetric tactics and low cost, high impact drones being used by these groups, it's the defense is also not always that expensive or that high tech.
Right, exactly. It always strikes me how closely tied these improvised drones are to legacy technologies. For example, like you talked about using a quadcopter to deliver a mortar round, right? I mean, the potential advantage of that is that you could possibly guide that mortar round to some extent. But otherwise, if you have a mortar tube, you simply don't need that quadcopter. The other thing that's interesting to me, Aditya, is that as you have also pointed out in the past, drones, or at least some sort of remotely piloted vehicles, are not exactly new. Can you tell us about how, for example, older hardware, older aviation technology has been repurposed as drones or used as decoy drones, and are there instances where this has proved effective?
I think there have been three instances that I can think of where a serious proposal has been thought of for repurposing older aircraft as decoy slash reconnaissance drones. So one is in India itself, our old MiG-21 fleet. People have been talking about converting it to these recon and decoy role with autonomous or semi-autonomous piloted systems. And I think one is Vietnam, which also has a MiG-21 fleet, which they're going to similarly put into use. And for an actual demonstrated case, you can look at Azerbaijan. So they used their ancient AN-2 aircraft as these recon slash decoy drones, which basically lured out to Armenian targets, and those got destroyed by their air defense complexes. The Armenians destroyed these AN-2s, which the Azerbaijanis sent as decoys, so that these air defense complexes, their positions were painted as targets of more sophisticated drones. So after these systems were, these air defense complexes were painted, these initial less sophisticated to converted aircraft got destroyed, and the more sophisticated and newer Israeli and Turkish supplied to drones by IAI and Bayraktar of Turkey, those more sophisticated drones destroyed these Armenian air defense complexes with both kamikaze suicide attack tactics. I think the II ones were that, and I think we also field those very similar type of those, and by firing projectiles at those air defense complexes, which the Bayraktar ones did. So the problem, I think, here has been that the air defense question, there is twofold. You have to have a net configured, accounting for various radar cross section size targets, and then on top of that, you have to choose what targets you engage and what you don't. So I think going forward, this business of spotting whether it's a new aircraft or an old aircraft, which is pretty much out of service for the site that it's in service with. So spotters, like now we have for artillery and for snipers, I think there's going to be a new kind of spotter in the forces of the future, which basically identifies if, hey, the target that's been intruding is what kind of a threat it poses. Is it just a decoy that is going to have minimal impact on our air defense positions, or is it something that's actually going to hit us directly?
That is really fascinating, and this is definitely going to be a space to watch. We're going to discuss more of this just after a short break. And don't go anywhere, folks. We'll be right back.
Hey, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On the Edges and Sledges Cricket Podcast, in the first half, Ashwin is joined by Varun to wrap India's ODI tour of Sri Lanka. In the second half, DJ joins the party to discuss the first T20 international between India and Sri Lanka. If you'd like to hear more about this match, former Indian cricketer Sabah Karim joins Rajiv Mishra on Khel Niti and they talk some more about it. Ladies and gentlemen, we're really excited to announce a show about crypto with Rohan Joshi. He's going to dive deep and demystify all this crypto stuff that we've been hearing about. And let me tell you a little bit more about stuff that's going on the network really quickly. Congratulations to Maru Kinayat, who celebrates 50 episodes of The Note with a discussion on health as a fundamental right. On Paisa Vaisa, Anupam talks to Harsha Chetanwala of MyWealthCrow.com. Zarina Poonawala is starting a new miniseries on emotional intelligence. Do check out the kickoff episode on the Empowering series. And Simplified talks about semiconductors. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show, or any other show for that matter, please do tell a friend. That's really helpful for us. And finally, we would like to thank our sponsors on the network this week. They make this all possible. Thank you very much. Ciet, Cred, Global Victoria, Bank of Baroda, Intuit India, Lenovo, and CoinSwitch Kuber. We really appreciate your support.
Welcome back, folks. We are discussing the international game of drones and how it plays out on modern battlefields. Now, back to you, Aditya. I want to ask you, can you tell us about some of the less stunning but more significant developments in drones in the West that have come to be? Can you tell us, for example, of instances where the end product, while it might have been called semi-autonomous or autonomous, was actually less high-tech than you might imagine?
So the funny thing is, earlier this year, when I was actually writing about the integrated review, and believe me, I was waiting for that document for almost 2 years.
This is the UK's integrated review.
The UK's integrated review. And it mentions that the Royal Navy is going to field autonomous mine countermeasure vessels. So, the end product was something that shook me. I think the Royal Navy's autonomous mine countermeasure vessels have the biggest moment for me. So the integrated review that came out earlier this year was talking about how autonomous systems will be used for mine countermeasure roles by 2025, 2030. I forget exactly which, but at the time they were saying we're going to do away with the currently in service mine hunting and mine countermeasure vessels, which are primarily a manned affair. So, as far as I, understand, this was some sort of a tall order goal kind of a thing. So, I was understandably hype about this. That, oh my God, someone like BAE is going to whip up a UUV, or UK will buy something from Boeing or Raytheon or something from their UUV offerings. But lo and behold, turned out to be literally small motor remote control boats on which you can place a crew with a command and control cabin. So it was really a letdown. This was one of the most technically correct and matches up to spec kind of a thing, but it ultimately was a letdown. That it almost felt like from a third party's perspective that this is the definition of malicious compliance, that meeting the lowest common denominator of the spec.
Yeah, I'm afraid that this entire field of not just drones, but more specifically semi-autonomous or autonomous systems is absolutely fraught with hype. And Aditya, as you and I have discussed, for example, the moment space travel was born, you needed some sort of semi-autonomous systems. Semi-autonomous systems are not just those that go in the air, but they're also, for example, like you alluded, so they could be surface vessels, they could be vessels that operate undersea, and there are all sorts of applications or roles for these type of systems. And drones is only one. Some drones are only a partial subset of these semi-autonomous and autonomous systems, and of course there are a whole bunch of other drones that don't fit into either of those categories.
So, Aditya, you recently wrote a section for our high-tech geopolitics newsletter, Technopolitik, which we will link in the description. So, you wrote about how autonomous weapons systems are bound to require, so to say, babysitting. So, could you elaborate on what exactly this means?
Sure. I mean, what I was basically talking about is I was alluding to a paper by Arthur Holland Michel. He's a researcher at UNIDA, which is the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, and he had written basically about. He was trying to examine what happens with edge cases. What happens when you have those difficult circumstances during combat, and how would an autonomous system perform in such cases? The other big bit of hype that we see in our times is, of course, AI. But as we all know, AI can be fairly brittle in certain circumstances. Now, if you consider the simple fact of war, the chaos of combat, the fog of war, and how these are persistent things throughout all human history, they are a constant feature of the past, the present, and the future. How is an AI system going to make sense of that? And basically, Michelle identified four underlying data issues. One is incomplete data, which can cause an autonomous system to either misclassify objects and activities or to fail to recognize progress towards a given goal. All right. So that's when you simply don't have enough data. Then you have low quality data, which is basically raw information where you have low signal to noise ratio. So lots of noise, very little signal, and you're not, again, able to make sense of what's going on. Then, of course, you have incorrect or false data. And this can happen either because, say, your sensors are faulty, conditions of combat, once again, are unpredictable, or your sensors could be damaged, smoke, dust, all of these things can get in the way. And so there's just that. And then there's also the fact of deception. Your adversary is always going to try and deceive you. All of this can result in false or incorrect data and the autonomous system making all sorts of mistakes. Then, of course, you have discrepant data. These are what I talked about, edge cases or corner cases. These are things that don't fit into categories that you anticipated when you program the autonomous system. As we all know, most types of AI, whether it's neural networks or any other type of AI, they basically are they are designed using a set of assumptions, right? So if you do not categorize, if you do not categorize everything, if you do not feed all the data needed into the autonomous system, certainly the AI might come across a situation where it has no idea what to do. If this sounds abstract to you, just consider the case of self-driving cars. So we know, for example, that self-driving cars do some things very well because of the sensors they have around them. They know exactly where what is. They're able to keep track of multiple moving objects at the same time. But there are other things which they weirdly struggle with. So, for example, when there are poor weather conditions, they sometimes make mistakes because their sensors are not able to figure out always what's going on. You also have some weird cases, for example, where a Tesla vehicle fatally struck a woman who was going across the street holding a bicycle. So, this seems to be a case where the AI couldn't exactly figure out what was going on. So you'll have all these type of edge cases or corner cases as well. And especially in the conditions of combat, you will have more of these. So, basically the point that he was making is that ultimately, the military effectiveness of an autonomous system may be limited. And such systems may actually end up being semi-autonomous and might require constant supervision from humans.
Interesting. And I think there's also that moral dilemma that if such an autonomous vehicle has to choose between the inhabitant inside it, the passenger inside, or the pedestrian on the road or the battlefield, whose life does it prioritize?
Absolutely. The so-called trolley problem that we have in ethics, which lives do you choose? Do you choose 5 lives over more lives? Is one life more valuable? Is a child more valuable than an adult? And so on. All of these things, are judgments that humans make. And, the funny thing is that it's, for us, for humans, it's more acceptable that humans make the flawed decisions, humans make the mistakes, rather than some machine. It's less disturbing when humans make the mistakes and people still get killed. That's weird, but that's certainly part of our expectations of what is required in order to take human life. So there's both the humanitarian aspect and the military effectiveness aspect. What are the decisions that a autonomous warplane is going to make? Is it just going to hit the wrong target? So the wrong target could be uninhabited, uh, but because you've not hit the target that you intended, you create all sorts of other problems. So yeah, it's an interesting subject, and this is one of the reasons why, for example, a lot of people have always been calling for humans in the loop to be there, to, in a sense, babysit the AI. AI is, I mean, I've often said this: AI is, requires babysitting every now and then. So you don't need to necessarily pay attention to it always, but you always have to be there, just in case it does something silly. So anyone who's done babysitting understands what I mean. So that's a fundamental challenge, I think, at least as of now, with AI and any kind of autonomous weapon system. The other thing is that this directly feeds into, like you said, not just humanitarian law, but also what is the mindset required for people who are doing this kind of babysitting? You and is what they're doing considered combat? If they're sitting somewhere where they are personally physically safe, is the sort of work combat? It's it may not be combat in the sense that we normally understand it, but it is an extremely stressful work environment. So what are the expectations required from those people? Do they get rest? Are teams circulated? Do you do tours of duty? All of this are things that we still need to figure out when we talk about the human in the loop. And everybody's going to actually come up with different answers to this, and that's one of the things that's going to make the inclusion of autonomous and semi-autonomous systems into militaries very interesting in an organizational sense in the coming decades. But yeah, so we've talked quite a bit about some of these high-level problems with drones. We've gone in and talked a little bit about Iran. But Aditya, I want to come back before we close on a subject that is close to your heart again. I like to track Iran's missile forces, but I know you like to look at Russia and Japan. So what I want to ask you is that we've seen some interesting developments there also, right? I mean, we do not normally associate the Russia-Japan relationship as one involving uncrewed aerial vehicles. But can you tell us what's happened recently?
Yeah, so I've talked about the use of UAVs on the Kuril Islands before. So Japan has taken cognizance of it that Orlan 10 UAVs have been used by the Russian military on the Kuril Islands, which is, in Japan's opinion, a territorial dispute. So on the four southern Kuril Islands, and which would be the four northern four northern territories islands for Japan, their Orlan 10 UAVs have been operating in conjunction with the Lead 3 electronic warfare system. So, see, Orlan 10 is a kind of UAV which is neither fully polished as a military product, nor is it a completely improvised thing. So it lays somewhere in between in the Russian military industrial complex. And I'm quoting from a few articles in the Japanese press over the past few days, which have been highlighting reports going as far back as 2018. So there's this entity called Inform Napalm in Ukraine, which basically studies all the asymmetric systems, electronic warfare, and UAVs in the war in eastern Ukraine, the Donbas region, etc. So, in that perpetual frozen conflict, they've been looking at pieces of the Orlan 10 UAVs which crashed there. So the data that they've collected reflects that the components that they recovered from these crashes, the UAV was actually made up of components which were sourced from across the globe, from Western countries, Germany, even the US, UK, and from Japan. So, interestingly, the engines used in huge chunk of these Orlan 10 UAVs was from a company called Saisakusho, which is a Japanese company which makes these engines primarily, and they cost to pretty much nothing for military. So these engines, they're four-stroke engines, which are fueled by gasoline, petrol as we call it in India. So they are very lightweight and deliver quite a horsepower punch, which gives that to UAV quite a capability to stay up in the air for a bit and actually have the horsepower to actually achieve speeds that would make it viable as a watching platform, as a aerial photography and amplification platform. So on the Kuril Islands, these UAVs, in conjunction with that EW system, has been even used to track down specific cell phone users and towers and to block their signal. This is according to the Japanese press, not me. And on the battlefields as far as Syria and Ukraine, they've been used in similar amplification of EW capabilities and aerial reconnaissance and photography, observation, targeting kind of a role. So this idea that the Russian military industrial complex does what it can with the resources and restrictions that come from Western sanctions, etc., and other limitations from the geostrategic equations that they've been a part of. So it's very fascinating to me that the Japanese press has picked up on something that was really news in 2018 to 2020. And they've suddenly tried to bring this out to the Japanese populace that, hey, a lot of stuff that people have been putting into civilian uses is actually, in their opinion, being misused rather, in military hardware that is actually infringing on the interest of the country it's being imported from. I think a very similar thing happened in the Azerbaijan-Armenia war recently as well. A few Canadian components showed up in UAVs which were fielded by Azerbaijan. So that was a huge scandal. So, in a similar way, this could have been a big story, but Japan doesn't really always have the stomach for escalating an issue which they can avoid.
That is really fascinating. And it's really interesting to me that this challenge of the proliferation of this technology and the almost impossibility of trying to control the spread of some of these technologies, especially the dual use technologies, is, I think, going to be a ongoing feature in the game of drones. We're just going to see a lot more of this, and it's going to create all sorts of perplexing problems for states, because both states and non-state actors are going to find new uses for these uncrewed vehicles, right? So you're going to be using them, like you said, for electronic warfare, for photo reconnaissance. You're going to be using them possibly for propaganda. And all of these new uses are going to create all sorts of new problems and challenges. And unfortunately, incidents like the MV Mercer Street are likely to continue for a long time to come, because these type of weapons are very useful for states trying to mount deniable or partly deniable attacks. And unfortunately, since that makes sense for a lot of states to do, it's going to continue. Drones seem to be, in that sense, a perfect weapon system for our time. They may not actually earn a lot of the hype that they get, but as a constant feature in our lives, unfortunately, they're here to stay. Of course, they could also potentially bring all sorts of opportunities for states like India. And, those opportunities are going to come along with threats, along with unpredictability. And this is a space that we'll continue to watch, not just in our newsletter, but of course, on All Things Policy. So with that, thank you, Aditya. And I'm sure that the world will give us more on this subject to discuss in future episodes.
Thanks, Aditya. Looking forward to it.
Well, and thank you all for joining us on All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Taksashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila_INST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Eventually, you'll see the end of your childhood,
Get accustomed to womanhood.
enjoy the experience of sisterhood,
Might get to wifehood
or not, choose motherhood.
or not. You'll learn to define your personhood,
Earn a livelihood,
change the neighborhood.
and get rid of the falsehood that life post-academia is easy.
So join me, Natasha,
And me, Ayushi,
on a journey from station starting point
to station, what now?
next station, Pudin station, and hopefully Agla station, adulthood.
Fresh episodes out every Thursday.
Namaste, this is Cyrus Brocha. I am part of the government cancel culture program to remove rubbish off all the different streams available. So what we have is all the collected rubbish we put together on our show. It's called Cyrus Says. It's on IVM podcast. You have to watch it and listen to it. It's on our app. It's on our website. It's on the YouTube channel. It's on Facebook. There are many different ways. Don't bother me and ask me how. You have to find out. We talk to different personalities. Many of them are known. Some are just people we meet downstairs and invite them up for chai. But the point is, it's fun and it's very therapeutic. So please join in and listen to Cyrus Says.